Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you if you're joining us tonight for the Emotional Balance Session 2. If you are joining us on Zoom, if I could just ask you if you could just make sure that your sound is muted. That will mean you don't pop up on the screen, and also that you won't pop up on the YouTube. If you're joining us on YouTube right now, welcome to you. It's great to have you here with us tonight. Hopefully, everyone's found the link to last week's session. So if you're joining us for the first time tonight, that's great. Welcome. The material should totally make sense to you. I'm going to do a little recap as we start, but it would probably be very helpful to go back to session 1 this week just to kind of get that full piece of content, and then that will make a lot of sense out of the week that we're doing, so everything would link together well before our final session next week. Great. Well, it's exciting to have many of you back, and it was lovely to receive quite a few positive comments during the week. To be honest, it's a little nerve-wracking just speaking into the void of Zoom and YouTube. Sorry, my brain is fried. I was recording a talk for New Wine this week, and my outtakes were terrible. I always try and do it in one take, and I think I spent 40 minutes recording segments of about 4 or 5 minutes, and every time I stumbled and fell and I had to go back and start again. Interestingly, when I prayed, I managed to deliver the whole thing in one hit, but that was after 40 minutes of struggle. So hopefully I can do a reasonable job tonight for you, but it's probably not going to be quite so fluid. Let's hope I can roll through this in a way which is helpful. So let's get started. Just again tonight, try and encourage you to stay super relaxed. I'm going to give some sort of 30-second breaks. So I'll sort of instruct you to take a breath. We're going to do some breathing practice as well halfway through the session tonight. And if you are on the Zoom from St. D's, then also you're welcome to chuck some questions in the chat, and I've got the YouTube open as well. So if you're on YouTube and you want to chuck some questions in the chat there, I can also respond to those, or I'll try to respond to them. If you can keep them succinct as possible, that would probably help me. Excellent. Well, let's open up with the idea of kind of the premise of our emotional imbalance, particularly looking at some of the rigid ideas that we began last week with. And I'm just going to share again the sort of initial slide I think I opened up with last week, which didn't have the red writing on. Let's just open it up. Sorry, it's a tiny bit small for you. But the first response we talked about in terms of emotional imbalance was that I've got no control over my feelings. So that was the kind of reactive position or assumption that many of us make. I feel what I feel when I feel it. I've got no control. This stuff just jumps on me. Secondly was the belief that external circumstances have to change for me to feel better inside. So, if my external circumstances are difficult, I'm going to feel bad. If my external circumstances are positive, I'm going to feel good. And then finally, I cannot tolerate painful emotions. So we talked about reactive, conditional, and intolerant beliefs. And these are really problematic because what they mean is we are unable to move forward because we have no control over our feelings. Our circumstances dictate how we respond to things, and we're intolerant to some of the emotions that we are then going on to experience. Now, I want to introduce these red appraised responses tonight. So the first one is, I can influence the way that I feel. So that was a learning from last week. Actually, I'm not hardwired to just feel, but actually my feelings can be influenced by a number of different things and they can change. So I've got influence over the way I feel. That's what we call responsive. So rather than reactive, I have no control. It's responsive. I can influence the way that I feel. And that knowledge can absolutely be a game changer as far as emotional balance is concerned for you. Then the conditional external circumstances must change for me to do better inside. We're changing that to an unconditional response. My feelings are not totally dependent on my circumstances. And if you look at that one, just notice I've put the word totally there, because our circumstances do have an impact on our feelings, but they are not entirely dependent on our circumstances. Actually, we can feel positively even in difficult circumstances. So again, we are not, if you like, under obligation to feel negative in negative circumstances. And you'll remember Paul's famous passage, I've learned the secret of being content in all circumstances. So there's an ability for us to feel differently in different circumstances. And then finally there, I cannot tolerate painful emotions. We're talking moving from intolerance to acceptance. I can experience painful emotions without fear. Now, this is really important, because what we're not talking about is an idea that we can get away from painful emotions. Painful emotions are a part of life, and actually painful emotions are helpful. They help us to process some of our experiences. But painful emotions are compounded when we feel afraid of those emotions themselves. So we might be having a difficult experience, but when we have a difficult experience and then we have painful emotions that respond to that experience, they can double down when we're afraid or intolerant of those emotions themselves. So it becomes a bit of a spiral. I feel uncomfortable. I refuse to tolerate those painful emotions. I feel fear because of their presence, and then I feel more painful emotions. And what we know about difficult emotions is the more accepting of them we are, the more transitory they typically are. Whereas the more resistant or repellent of them they are, the more reflexive they become, and they tend to intrude more powerfully and create other sorts of anxieties. So this is a little bit of a recap on last week. I hope that many of us who've been watching and engaging with this material will have found a change from reactive to responsive, from conditional to unconditional, and from intolerance to acceptance. And we're going to work a little bit further down the line with those things just as we press ahead. I wonder how your week has gone and whether you were able to put into practice any of the overview that we gave of the response to the autonomic nervous system. And it might have just been a small thing. And many people say, well, I haven't really had a very scary experience, Will, so I didn't really get to change anything. But actually, just the awareness of the nervous system and the two aspects of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, can help us, if you like, to manage the difficulties of our weeks. So it might not have been that you diverted a particularly difficult circumstance, but it might be that you were aware of your ability to escalate a problem rather than de-escalate it. And so I hope that was helpful. We're going to go back into that in just a moment. And I guess I wanted to ask you, have you had a chance, did you take any steps to do any breathing exercises or to appraise your thinking at any point during the week? I'm sure you did. Congratulations if you did. It will have made a difference. Just to encourage you all, this stuff takes time. So people I coach and people I help with their emotional health through Mind Soul Foundation, they are urgent for immediate results. They're like, I just want to be free of this painful, difficult emotion. I just want to get my balance back. I just want to sort this out as quickly as possible, or it doesn't seem to be working. It's a bit like going to the gym and lifting really heavy weights and then asking the gym instructor whether you're stronger yet. You might be more tired, your arms might hurt more. It's unlikely that you're going to be stronger after one session in the gym. But after multiple sessions over a period of time, you'll find that actually you can lift heavier weights and you've got stronger. So my key encouragement with this stuff is to persist with it, make it a practice, a daily practice, and it will become second nature to you. And that's when it really begins to help. Now, I ended last week, we were talking about how beliefs, if you like, the beliefs we held could fuel the fight or flight or freeze response, and how actually we need to challenge some of our core beliefs in order to have a more flexible view, and therefore to, if you like, disempower the flow we have to fight, flight, or freeze. And I mentioned at the end of last week the idea that we could actually stimulate the second nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, to enable us, if you like, to stop an out of control spiral of worry, fear, and adrenal response. Before we get into that, I just wanted to make it really clear that our objective is not to be anxiety free. Now, when we talk about an illness like depression, it's an illness, and therefore we could say our ambition is to be free from depression. But when we're dealing with the autonomic nervous system, our ambition is never to be free from anxiety. And if you're a Christian and you're watching this, you might have picked up, if you like, a negative perception of anxiety in Scripture. And I think we have to be quite careful about labeling that, because when we're talking about the sort of fear that binds a person, or sort of anxiety that binds a person, that's problematic fear. But some fear is really helpful. And, you know, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, for example, is a way in which fear can be a really good thing. Being afraid of an army that's going to overwhelm you is a good thing, because it's a protective function. And anxiety has a core protective function in our lives. Some Christians are very keen to sort of bat anxiety away, and they talk about binding anxiety or casting out anxiety. And that would be like chopping off your arm and throwing it away. The autonomic nervous system is fundamental to our lives, to our survival, to our function, and actually we need it to live. What we're not talking about here is how we can wire away or dismiss the sympathetic adrenal response, because that is absolutely necessary to life and living. What we are saying is that system can become problematic when it becomes oversensitive, and if you like, it takes on a life of its own. And the way I describe this is a bit like a car alarm. When me and my wife Louie lived in Harrow, we had very small children at the time, and the neighbour had a very old Audi, which he was very proud of, and I think he'd put a big stereo in there, and he'd fitted a very expensive alarm. Now, unfortunately, the alarm was probably more expensive than the car, and it was incredibly sensitive. So, you know, if a car alarm goes off, it should be because someone's trying to smash the window and drive away in the car. But if a squirrel ran past the wheel of this particular Audi, you know, the alarm would go off. And if a leaf fell off the tree, it would flutter down, land on the windscreen, and the alarm would go off. And I used to be absolutely terrified that this guy was going to park his car outside my house, which he did regularly, because as soon as you saw it parked outside your house, guarantee you weren't going to sleep very well that night, because the alarm would be going off over and over again, many times during the night. Now, what we're dealing with here when we're trying to address the sympathetic nervous system is not the necessity for an alarm, because that's a good thing, that's a necessary thing. It's about what happens when that alarm begins to become too sensitized, and actually it starts going off at all sorts of random times when there isn't actually any danger to respond to. And circumstances where that might be the case could be that we have a developed anxiety disorder, but quite often is actually just our stress response. I talked last week about Hooke's law, about pressurizing the spring. When we've been under pressure for a long time, our autonomic nervous system become hypersensitized, and we can become very stressed, and our fight or flight response becomes very, very automatic and very, very frequent. And what we want to do is try and calm that system down, because it becomes a bit of a loop where events, remember, lead to thoughts and emotions, which lead to either more thoughts and emotions and decisions, or to a physiological response where we begin to experience quickening heart rate, dilating pupils, blood moving towards our major muscle groups and away from our hands and feet, feeling cold, sweats, dispersonalization, and all these other unpleasant symptoms. So what we're trying to do here is make an intervention at a moment when we are finding that our fight or flight response is activated, but for no good reason. How do you discern whether it's activated for no good reason? Well, normally it's because there's no danger present. And as someone who's experienced and had, a significant number of panic attacks, I know that there's a big difference between me jumping back from the curb when a London bus zooms by and me being in a completely safe place, but suddenly feeling very anxious and agitated. And what we're trying to deal with here is the latter, not the former. So let's get into this idea that actually there are ways of us intervening in the flow of our anxiety to live with greater balance. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the point at which our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous systems are working alongside one another effectively. So if you have a look at this slide, we go back to week 1, the idea that there's an event, and it might be, for example, a loud bang in the street as a car drives over a Coke can. The thought and emotion is, oh my goodness, that's a kind of gun going off, an explosion. We go into analytical thoughts, thinking, how would that happen? Why has that happened? Is that realistic? Is that really what is happening? And we have to make a decision to act or not to act. There are physical changes responding to the thoughts and emotions we've had about the events, and it's grabbed our attention. Now, at this point, it's not catastrophic. We're just working through the process. Now, we can appraise our thoughts in a new way. Instead of thinking, oh, a bomb's gone off, we might be thinking the car has driven over a Coke can. But our physiological changes are already in motion. And if you like, at the end of this flow, our parasympathetic recovery is happening. So that's an outworking of us coming to the end of this process of the autonomic activation. But we can actually make an earlier intervention with the parasympathetic nervous system to help to calm us when we're mid-process. So this is a complex and also a wonderful thing to understand. So typically, the event is maybe not as dramatic as the car driving over the Coke can. Maybe the event is someone looking at you in a slightly strange way in church. Maybe they make you feel like they might be off with you, which is a common thing. People say to me, oh, Jane looked at me and she looked cross. Now, Jane might not have even engaged with you, but she was looking cross because, I don't know, her son was messing around with the microphones at the front of church. But the thought and emotion is, oh my goodness, Jane is cross with me. Analytical thoughts are, what have I done to upset Jane? Physical changes is higher heart rate, palpitations, starting to feel cold, uneasy, dispersonalized, etc., etc. Now, do I have to wait until the end of that process till I thought myself into a panic before I find parasympathetic recovery? No, I can engage with parasympathetic intervention earlier on in the cycle. So, for example, I could physically begin a process of relaxation, and that's what we're going to talk about in just a minute. The key point here is that there is not a sort of inevitable end, that you can actually get involved in the process of finding balance earlier rather than later. And people who get the hang of this are not undoing the reality of a difficult situation, but what they are doing is bringing a greater level of balance and understanding to the situation, because they haven't, if you like, caught themselves in this great spiral of anxiety and panic. I know that sharing this, some of you who are watching will be thinking, that sounds super complicated. A parasympathetic intervention, it all seems to happen so quickly. How on earth could I put the brakes on? Well, don't worry, just relax, and we'll go into what that looks like slightly in detail. The key thing is that it can feel hard to unpick the two. It can feel quite difficult to separate out what feels like a high-speed process towards catastrophe, and then say, well, actually, I can kind of put this intervention in here and put this intervention in there. And again, I would say that training creates space to make interventions. So the more aware you are of this journey, the more able you are to kind of pull a pause and say, actually, I just need to calm down. We do it in society now. We do it in families now. We say to our children when they get really emotional, okay, I want you just to count to 10. or just have some space. Or we might say to a friend who's in a panic, just sit down and take some deep breaths, or let me make you a cup of tea. Now, interestingly, all of those things are also interventions. We might not know why we're doing them, but they all make a difference. And effectively, they are doing what I've just described, which is about making an intervention in the flow of the fight or flight response and offering some parasympathetic intervention to calm the system and restore balance. There are lots and lots of different methodologies for this, and I've always been very interested into why they work. And I want to suggest to you tonight, as this is a tale of two cities, because we're going to deal with worry thoughts a bit later on, but we're going to stay practical right now and suggest to you that a core reason that the parasympathetic intervention works is because specifically of breathing. Now, two psychologists, Gotteston and Band, say that respiratory discipline, in turn, could parsimoniously explain the physical and mental benefits of contemplative activities through changes in autonomic balance. That sounds really wordy, doesn't it? I hope it's not throwing you off course. Let me read it again. Respiratory discipline, that means breathing, could turn parsimoniously, or could in turn parsimoniously explain, this is alongside another theory, the physical and mental benefits of contemplative activities. Now, they might be activities like mindfulness training or Pilates or breathing activities with specific visualization through changes in the autonomic balance. That's the balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. So what these psychologists did was basically look at loads and loads of different meditative practices, and they were trying to work out why they all worked to a level in calming people's anxiety. And what they've suggested is actually that the commonality between all of these different practices is breathing. Breathing is the thing. It's so obvious, though. No one really wants to believe that breathing can do this incredible job of bringing calm and bringing balance. And I guess the science behind it is the activation of something called the vagus nerve. It's nothing to do with gambling. It's nothing to do with America. It's a nerve just in your brainstem. And if you think, let me just take this away and I'll just going to teach you a little brain model. So I love this idea of the hand model of the brain. Okay. So if you like, just take a minute, hold up your hand like mine. I want you to imagine this is your brain. Now, I want to suggest that the knuckle on your thumb here is the amygdala. And that's really a center for anxiety and anxious thoughts. And that really is the hot core of where we perceive our dangers. And at the end, you've got the hypothalamus, which is a piece of the brain which is responsible for kind of ideas and dreams. And that forms a very, very core part of our brain, a little kind of walnut-shaped piece of brain. Now, I want you to then cross that over, because that sits right at the heart of you, and look at the base now of the heel of your hand. I want you to imagine that's your brain stem. So this is your spinal cord, your forearm here. Now, if you fold your fingers over the top, this is your frontal lobe, and this is this part of your brain. This is responsible for kind of high and rational thinking. Now, if you think about it, we are very, very physically driven by the autonomic nervous system, because if you think the amygdala there is much closer to our spinal column and therefore our body's response than our high thinking frontal lobe, which is responsible for sort of cooling rational thought. So actually, in terms of precedence, you see the amygdala working first. Now, if you just track down against the heel of your brain, the vagus nerve is right in here. And the vagus nerve, if you like, is the nerve that tracks between our autonomic response and our physiological reaction. And that's the nerve that we are trying to stimulate when it comes to bringing calm and rest. Stimulation of the vagus nerve slows our heart rate. And if you like, it's the main route from which all of the parasympathetic nervous response, recovery response, is initiated. So this is like the safety valve in our brains to help calm our systems. The vagus nerve right here can be artificially stimulated in order to bring calm to the body and rebalance the autonomic system. Now, it's an amazing piece of creation. It's an incredible piece of biology. Not many people know about the vagus nerve, but it's really well recounted in science. And we can stimulate the vagus nerve by breathing. Wow, isn't it incredible? Here's a simple system. Last week, I introduced a couple of breathing activities, and I want to go back through them in a little bit more detail today. So let's get kind of what I'd call grounded. Now, one of the things which really stops people from finding success in artificially stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system is that they're so physically tense. And their physical tension creates a bit of an audio loop where their body is reading, their mind is reading their body's tension and believing that there is danger present. If you ever watch any of those 999 videos, you'll see that they start pumping their hands before they punch someone. That's because when we are physically stimulated and we begin to tense, the same tension, if you like, creates a loop back to our amygdala again, and we find ourselves getting more adrenaline, not less adrenaline. So you can pump yourself up as well as relax yourself down. So the first thing we have to do is scan for physical tension. And the way I do that is often raising my shoulders and then dropping my shoulders completely. So I'd love you to try just doing that right now. It's the simplest thing in the world. Raise your shoulders right up and now drop your shoulders. And you'll feel your arms hanging by your sides like an incredible weight. Amazingly, we use a lot of tension in the body to hold ourselves up. But when we tense and then relax, we find a position of relaxation. I always find it's helpful to place my feet with the soles flat on the floor, not crossed in any way. Because when we're feeling tense, we often cross our bodies and cross our legs and we hold ourselves. That gives us comfort. But the holding activity also compresses us and therefore assists in this loop of pumping us up with adrenaline. So unfold, relax, feet flat on the floor. And now I want you to notice the palms of your hands. When people are tense and anxious, they typically wring their hands or pressurize their palms because these areas are very, very sensitive and filled with nerve endings. So I want you to open your hands, palm side up, and then rest your palms on your thighs. Now, if you're in a restaurant and you're getting anxious, you can do this and you'll look completely normal. So you can just rest your hands on your thighs, open your hands palm side up, drop your shoulders and find a position of relaxation. That's the first step. Now let's introduce some of the breathing. So what we're trying to do with the breathing is always to make sure that the out breath is longer than the in breath. So just to go back into a little bit of the autonomic response, when we are initiated in fight or flight by the sympathetic nervous system, we want to oxygenate our lungs as much as possible because we potentially have to use superhuman energy to run away from whatever danger there might be. So we might want to, if we're running away from a bear in the woods, we need to run really quickly. And our bodies know that. So it loads up with oxygen in advance. So we start shallow breathing and panting. And that panting hyperoxygenates our blood. So we can use the oxygen in order to give us the energy we need to run really, really quickly. Normally, as a precursor to the fight or flight response, at least our awareness of it, we've begun breathing in a shallow and panty way. Some people sigh a lot before they begin to feel that swimmy feeling. And they'd say, oh, I don't breathe deeply, but actually they're gulping air in a way. And so that creates anxiety. We want to deoxygenate, not over-oxygenate. So number one tip here is that the out breath is always longer than the in breath. We're always trying to breathe out more than we are trying to breathe in. An over-oxygenated bloodstream, when we're not using that oxygen, is the sort of journey towards the panic attack. It's really unpleasant. But deoxygenation is really helpful, helps us feel grounded and normal again. So relax the body, chin slightly forward, and now we're breathing in. We're going to start by breathing in for 5 and out for 7. So that's just simple as that. So in for 5, out for 7. That's the simplest model. Now, when we're breathing out, we're aware of our breath and we're trying to relax out with the out breath. So we're not forcing it away, but a way to manage your oxygen intake is actually to breathe in through the nose, because obviously your nasal holes are much smaller than your mouth, and that restricts the amount of oxygen you can take up within that first in-breath, and your mouth, the exhalation, you can sort of blow it away. So try it like this. And that's the same activity, slightly more effective, in through the nose, out through the mouth, all the time staying physically relaxed. So the first model, the first simple understanding of how to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagus nerve in particular is to use our breath, to relax our body and to breathe through our nose and out through our mouth, making sure our out breath is longer than our in breath. Now, this sort of breathing that is most effective for relaxation and for stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system is what's called diaphragmatic breathing. I'm just going to sit up a bit in the camera. Now, your diaphragm is here. It's just sort of at the end of your rib cage. Now, what we're trying to do is really what I call belly breathing. So if you think about your lungs as having two halves, your upper lung, which is very efficient for increasing oxygenation over a short period of time, and your lower lung, which does a slightly different job and helps you to relax. What we're trying to use diaphragmatic breathing, which opens up the diaphragm and draws oxygen into the lower part of the lung, and then we're pushing that away. Now, that whole process takes longer. It's less efficient, but it actually stimulates our relaxation system again. So what I want you to do is focus on your tummy. And this time you might put your hands on your tummy. And what we're going to do this time is, rather than 5 and 7, is what's called the 7-11, which I introduced last week. So this time it's in for 7. And I want you to try and feel your tummy coming out on the in-breath. So as we come in, our tummy is kind of opening out as our diaphragm opens up. And as we're blowing away, our tummy is drawing in and up into our diaphragm. So we're trying to use our diaphragm. Imagine it's a bit like a pair of bellows for the fire. We're drawing oxygen in, and then we're pushing oxygen out. And that diaphragmatic breathing is really, really powerful. So that's what we're going to try and do right now. So I'll start by counting you and moving to show you the breath. So just nice and relaxed, shoulders up, shoulders down, uncross, ground your feet, open your hands. And then we're going to come in through the nose for 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now blow away for 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And now we're breathing in for 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And out again for 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And relax. So the 7-11 breathing technique is probably the most simple because it's the most natural. In for 7 through the nose, out for 11 from the mouth, and trying to use your diaphragm to drive out, sucking in the air away from you, and then drive in and up when you are blowing away. Now, you're going to need to spend a bit of time working on this diaphragmatic breathing because it's quite a skill, but I would suggest that you try 3 times a day to do 3 cycles of the 7-11 if you're beginning. Once when you wake up in the morning, then again at lunchtime, and then again in the evening. Just try and become a little expert at that technique, and it will make a massive difference to you. And if you are feeling like actually anxiety and imbalance and tension are beginning to build within you, go straight into the breathing technique. And for me, this was one of the ways in which I overcame panic attacks very, very early on in my journey out of anxiety, was learning that if I could control my breath and stimulate the vagus nerve, that actually I could push away from panic and begin to get panic attacks under control, which I did very effectively. And I went from having 9 panic attacks a night, often waking up in my sleep in panic, to having not had a panic attack now for 15 years. So I know this technique works. The thing is, I don't just give up on the technique. I keep using the technique because I know it's helpful for me, not just to control panic, but also just to generally relax. Great. Take 30 seconds, and I'm just going to be quiet for a second. And I want you to try and, just in your comfort of your own home, practice the 7-11 breathing technique. I think I'll give you slightly more than 30 seconds because I want you to try and do 3 cycles So that's going to require 33 seconds, no, plus the in-breaths. So you're going to need a minute or thereabouts. So I'll give you a minute to practice the breathing technique. Don't worry too much about the diaphragmatic aspect at the moment. Just focus more on the nose and the mouth and making sure you get the timing right. So let's take a breath. 1 minute. I'm going to start the clock, and I want you to try and do 3 cycles of the 7-11. Okay, let's come back together. I hope you found that helpful. Definitely something you can practice and grow in greater confidence with. Before we move on, I want to just illustrate just one more breathing technique. It's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's very, very powerful. In fact, it's used by Navy SEALs before they go into war zones, and so it must be pretty effective. I use it if I'm feeling like if I'm really struggling and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. I find it super helpful. It's called box breathing. And box breathing is the idea, actually, instead of having a differential between the 7 and 11, the box breathing splits our breathing cadence into 4 sections. So if you imagine it's a box with 4 equal sides, it's a perfect square, and it's in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. So imagine a square in front of me. So I'm going up the line, breathing in for 4, again, through the nose. Then I'm holding my breath for 4 beats. Then I'm exhaling diaphragmatically for 4 beats. And then I'm holding across the bottom for 4 more beats. So the cadence is absolutely even. But if you think about what I'm doing here, I'm actually only breathing in for 1/4 of the cycle. So if you think the 7-11, the differential is quite small between inhalation and exhalation, with box breathing, it becomes quite big. So it's quite powerful. And if you're really feeling panicky, box breathing is a brilliant technique. Again, you can become really efficient at this, and it's something to have in your armory if you're trying to find emotional balance. Let me just model it for you so you've got an idea. I'll just do a couple of cycles. So in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. Now, it doesn't look so relaxed as the 7-11 does, but it's very, very effective in bringing your blood oxygen levels down to normal levels, and is very, very effective at stimulating the vagus nerve. So again, a good one to try, and there's loads of resources online if you want to try and find out a bit more about box breathing. So 2 techniques, box breathing and the 7-11 technique, are great ones to start with. Interestingly, if neither of those appeal to you, you can still stimulate the vagus nerve and, if you like, promote some sort of parasympathetic intervention if you're starting to feel anxious. Gargling loudly is very effective. Singing loudly is effective. It's very relaxing. A foot massage does an amazing work on this. Cold water on the face. I know people find cold swimming very beneficial if you're If you're fit enough for that, fantastic. Some people find just immersing their face in cold water. Laughter does a very good job. And there's also a particular technique, which is a pressure rebalancing technique, which you use when you're in a swimming pool and you've gone down very low. And that is to inhale and then exhale against your nose and mouth as they're closed. So hold your nose, hold your mouth, and push. And that activity, that particular maneuver, can also stimulate the vagus nerve. So a few other ideas there. The key thing is this is all very physical, but it has a real psychological impact. And for example, Gertson and Band would suggest even breath awareness can transform your emotional experience. So even just the awareness of your breathing will lower your breath rate and improve your output. So just an awareness of your breath can be a game changer as far as your nervous system is concerned. It can, if you like, create autonomic balance. And that's why this is really, really key. So even if you didn't become proficient at the techniques, just your awareness of your breath might have a really, really positive impact on your emotional health. Okay, I've said quite a lot about that stuff. I'm just aware that we've just got 20 minutes left. I just want to look at the cycle I showed you last week when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system. I showed you that there was a cycle which we typically go through. And this is the cycle between thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. So this is the typical flow that we go through when the event leads us to think, oh my goodness, this is a catastrophe. My belief is nobody likes me. My emotions are to feel very low. My behavior is to withdraw. So this is again, the office environment. I'm at the water cooler with Sue. Sue has had a bad morning, but I don't know that. At the water cooler, she begins to fill up her cup. I go over coincidentally and say, how are you, Sue? She ignores me. I try and crack a joke. She carries on ignoring me and walks away. She's lost in her own world, but I'm thinking, wow, Sue really hates me. I believe I'm unworthy or unwelcome in the office environment. I feel low and I begin to withdraw from Sue and feel like she might be off with me. How many of you have had an experience like that? I'm sure many of you have had an experience just like that. So thoughts lead to beliefs, lead to emotions, and then lead to behaviors. But what does calm look like? Well, it begins by starting off by appraising the thoughts. So this might be to think, actually, in that circumstance, maybe Sue is having a bad day and it's not actually about me. So that's an appraisal of what I originally believed, which was, wow, Sue's really off with me. The belief, oh, I'm not really worthy to be in this environment anyway, needs to be then challenged. There's an appraisal of thought, there's a challenge of belief. So I'm saying, Will, is that really true? You know, you should be in this environment. This is a good space for you. You deserve to be here. So I'm challenging a false belief. Now, my emotions are already in play, but rather than reacting and going, oh my goodness, this is a complete disaster, now my day is ruined, I observe my emotions without so much judgment. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I'm feeling a bit sad now, but maybe I'm reacting to a negative thought and a false belief. So I'm observing, but I'm not pushing away or denying. And then my behaviors, I seek to moderate my behavior. And moderation is, oh, that's interesting. I feel like withdrawing now, but actually I'm not going to do that because that would be ridiculous. Or I'm not going to do that because actually that would be counterproductive. That's probably a kinder way of saying it. Or actually, rather than withdrawing, I'm just going to go over and properly ask Sue if she's doing all right. So I might change my behavior. So what I'm suggesting here is, in the whole flow of how we can end up out of balance in the sympathetic nervous system, feeling deeply anxious and behaving, if you like, in a withdrawn way or in a dynamic way, which is self-defeating, when our thoughts, beliefs, and emotions and behaviors are concerned, we can appraise, challenge, observe, and moderate. And that will lead us to a place of calm. So this is really talking seriously now about making some big interventions here in the natural flow of your autonomic response. And you might again be thinking, wow, Will, this is really complex. I don't think I could do this. I want to say that this is absolutely available to every person, that we have the ability to appraise our thoughts, challenge our beliefs, observe our emotions, and moderate our behaviors. And all that can bring calm. And remember, add in the physiological practices which I've just described, like the breathing technique, that also can give us space and diversion from going straight down the rabbit hole. And if I'm honest, for me, this was a classic problem. I think because I'd always been a worrier, I was really good from going from minor issue to death in about 3 steps. I kind of, have a headache, and the next thing I know, I had a brain tumor in my mind. And so I'd become so automatic between my initial thought and my, if you like, my catastrophic thought. I didn't believe there was any possibility of change. And there were always emotions and behaviors thrown in there. But appraisal, challenge, observation, and moderation, they are the kind of bedrock of what it looks like to begin to find emotional balance. Again, it takes practice, but my encouragement to you is to actually make some post-it notes and stick them up on your fridge door or something to remind you that you have the power to intervene. And when you intervene, amazing things happen. I just love the fact that the hormone that the parasympathetic nervous system produces is acetylcholine, and it slows your heart rate. I can never say it, but it begins with acetylcholine. And that it's helpful for me always to know that there is stuff that's flowing into my bloodstream which is bringing calm. Everyone knows about adrenaline and cortisol that create energy and stress, but ACE is just exactly what you need when you're having a really, really bad day. So encouragement for that this stuff really works. Well, in the last few minutes, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about worry. Next week, we're going to be wrapping up with some different strategies and ideas, and we're looking at the way in which perfectionism, guilt, worry all interface with one another. But some people have, again, they would typically ask me, how do I deal with the worry that initiates this process? So let's get into the thoughts idea for a minute, and then we can sort of, if you like, take a slightly different approach to that thought. Because wouldn't it be amazing if we could address that initial thought on the flow between thoughts, beliefs, emotions, and behaviors? And the first thing to tell you is that psychologists disagree about how many thoughts we have a day, but there are a significant number, between 18 and 50,000 thoughts a day. But if you think about that number of thoughts, only a small number of those thoughts are actually useful for life and living. Can you imagine the 50,000 thoughts you had today? How many of those thoughts do you really remember? I mean, 20 or 30 or maybe even 100, but 50,000. What I can tell you is that we have effectively a stream of consciousness running through our minds. But because we aren't stimulated by very much of it, it just flows, if you like, in one ear and flows out the other. But very often, particularly when we're stressed and tired, some threatening thoughts will poke through into our conscious mind, and we'll become very aware of them. And what we have to do is become aware of the fact that we can get stimulated and exhausted in a way that makes those threats feel more real than they really are. And these are what we call worries. Now, the challenge is that they're not just all of one type. There are actually 2 different sorts of worry. So there are what we call solvable worries on the one hand, let's put them over here, and floating worries on the other. Let's just talk for a minute about solvable worries. So solvable worries are things that you really need to pay attention to. So if your boss at work says, look, Will, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to make you redundant. What you don't go is, oh, this is just a ridiculous worry. I've just got to chill out and just carry on with business as usual, because it's a fact. You're actually going to be made redundant, and there's a time frame involved, and it requires work. You've got to apply problem-solving techniques to solvable problems. So you've got to go away, work on your CV, start looking for new jobs, organize your finances. There's a lot of stuff that has to happen when you're engaging with a solvable worry. The trouble is that solvable worries probably form less than 1% of all the worry thoughts that intrude in our mind. The majority of things that we're dealing with are what are called floating worries. And floating worries don't have any real definition. Floating worries tend to reappear regularly in different guises. So take my wake up in the middle of the night idea. You wake up in the middle of the night feeling like you've got a slight headache, maybe even a bit of a migraine, you feel a bit achy and exhausted. The floating worry is an automatic negative thought, an ant. So imagine it as an ant. The automatic negative thought might say, well, Will, you've probably got a brain tumor. So immediately the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated. You feel a flow of adrenaline running through your bloodstream. Your heart starts to race. You suddenly do feel quite ill. You become hypersensitized to your symptoms. Then you go and visit Dr. Google, who tells you that you've got one of 75 different diseases, including the bubonic plague. And then you're really worried and you're in an absolute panic spiral of anxiety and completely out of balance. So ants pop into our minds and they wreak havoc. And the key thing here, where the thought intervention, is addressed, is that we can label our thoughts early on in the process. So we can ask ourselves the question: is this a solvable problem or a floating worry? So is it time limited? Does it require a real problem solving response? Or is it something that's intruding in our mind without any real basis? So this would be like, John comes to me at church and says, Will, I'm really worried that no one likes me. Now, it's a really interesting worry. Is it solvable? If I take John up to the front of church and say, hey, everyone, do you like John? They're Christians. What are they going to do? Of course, they're going to say they like John. Then John's going to come back next week and say, Will, I'm really worried about the integrity of the church. I'm not going to make any progress with this because John's worry is a floating worry and actually cannot be resolved. And so he needs to address it in a different way. Problem-solving strategies don't resolve floating worries, but labeling impacts our response. And so when we label the thought as an ant, an automatic negative thought, we respond less powerfully to it because actually it doesn't require the response we initially believed it did require. And one way in which we can become expert at this is by keeping a thought record chart and becoming aware of what I call themes of worry. So typically people have a selection of ants that are really common to them. So it might be health worries like the one I've just addressed. It might be financial worries, relationship worries, existential worries, faith worries. But if you keep a thought record chart, that's a record of the different automatic negative thoughts you're having every day, you'll quickly find similar themes. And by writing them down, you'll be reassured that actually, if another one pops into your mind, it's likely nothing to worry about. Now, of course, worry doesn't work like that. So you'll still be worried, but you'll be slightly less worried and more able to make an intervention. Here's some strategies about worry which we know definitely don't work. So people tend to do the same thing over and over again without success. And these strategies are firstly just not worrying. Honestly, if that worked, it really wouldn't be a worry at all. Secondly, the idea of answering every worry. This is a real temptation that we try and find the answer to floating worries with a solvable process. And actually, you just cannot. You tend to get a little bit of reassurance initially. You might ask a friend if they think that what you're worrying about is going to happen. They'll say no. You'll feel better, but then you'll just want more reassurance. Answering every worry is not a strategy that succeeds. And the third and final strategy that tends to fail is thought suppression, just pushing it down. If you push it down, it tends to bounce up much more quickly. So those strategies don't work when it comes to managing automatic negative thoughts. And actually, we need to find a new approach if we're going to find some success. And one of the ways in which we can work with this is actually addressing the process of worry and allowing a slightly more curious approach. If you think about worry as a process, we tend to think that the process of worrying itself will resolve something. So worry makes you feel like you're doing something important, even being caring. And I'd illustrate it by suggesting it's like a hamster in a hamster wheel. The hamster looks at the wheel and thinks, humans use wheels to go to places. I know what I'm going to go into the wheel on. I'm going to get somewhere new. So they climb into the wheel, run and run and run and run, and then fall out of the wheel exhausted. They thought they were going to get somewhere, but they've got nowhere. So worry is very cathartic initially because it makes us feel like we're making progress. But worry is not helping us to resolve anything. In fact, we never really resolve floating worries. They're a bit like those push pencils from the 80s. It's the red lead, and then the red lead is there, and you're like, oh no, oh my goodness, the red lead is there. You worry, 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 and then the red lead disappears, and you're like, oh, a moment of peace. And then the green lead appears, and you're like, oh no, the green lead. But worrying's got nothing to do with the way the leads change. 6 months later, the red lead comes back, and you're like, I'm sure I've worried about this before. Because worry is a cyclical process, and the process doesn't have anywhere to go. It's cyclical. It just comes around the block over and over again. So a key response here is recognizing that it's not caring. People say, oh, I worry about my kids because I care about them. Actually, they'd rather you didn't worry about them in that way. If it's not solvable, it's not effective. And so we need to be a bit more curious about the process and say, actually, hold on a minute, this isn't really getting me anywhere. I've got to change my strategy. And you might like to use this little acrostic when you're caught in the spiral of worry, and that is fear, false evidence appearing real. Of course, in all circumstances, that might not be the case, but the autonomic nervous system is actually really good at discerning which is real and which is false. And the automatic physical response is nearly always a response to real danger, whereas the conjugated and ruminative response is nearly always one that isn't responding to real danger. So if you're really thinking about it hard, the probability is it's just false evidence appearing real. So begin to be a little bit cautious, a little bit skeptical about what the automatic negative thought is offering you, what it's suggesting. And a way in which you can do that is just changing, again, your relationship with this belief that you cannot tolerate negative feelings. That's why changing that belief is so important, because we have to, if we're going to effectively overcome this imbalance, is tolerate uncertainty more effectively. And what we do there is actually we welcome a level of risk. So our world is entirely risk averse. It says, you need to resolve every problem. You need to fix everything right now. Know that you're safe. But actually, that love of certainty doesn't make us more safe. And it doesn't actually, in the long term, make us more reassured, because our ability to be reassured is diminished by our love of certainty. So we have to welcome a level of risk. So if I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I've got a brain tumor because I've got a mild headache, I have to say, yeah, maybe I have got a brain tumor. I'll deal with that tomorrow. I'm going to risk going back to sleep right now, and then I'll think about it when I'm properly awake. So you can actively welcome risk and accept the fact that you can tolerate uncertainty. And the more you can tolerate uncertainty, the more effective you'll be, both at diverting away from those habitual patterns of the sympathetic nervous system kind of running amok in your life, and also creating the space to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system to the point at which you actually feel relaxed and can discern the ants from the solvable problems. So you're sharpening your skills on all levels here, physiologically and psychologically, in order to deal with the challenges you're facing. Now, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through worry, and I'm going to come back to some of this material for you to recap next week. But my final slide tonight is a spiritual one again, similar to last week. And that is that calm can be achieved remarkably. And in the scripture is the great, God is the great psychologist. And Philippians chapter 4, verses 4-8 really help us to practice calm. And you can see the acrostic here. I want to encourage you to move out of tonight's session with this in mind. When we are up against it, if you like, when the ants are really pressing in on us and we feel out of balance, that adrenaline and anxiety and stress are overwhelming us, the first thing, prayerfully, celebrate God's goodness. In Philippians 4:4, it says, rejoice in the Lord always. I say it again, rejoice. So give thanks. Gratitude training, is an incredible thing. Give thanks to the Lord. Rejoice in the Lord. Secondly, ask God for help. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Now, this is interesting. What Paul is not saying here is don't be anxious. And that's it. It's don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer, petition, and thanksgiving, present your request to God. So he's not just saying don't be anxious. He's saying don't be anxious about anything specifically, and bring those things to God in this way: prayer, petition, and thanksgiving. He gives you something specific to do, which all have a positive psychological effect. Prayer helps you articulate to another the struggle. Petition reinforces what you really want. And gratitude training transforms what you feel about it. And that's aside from the fact that God actually hears your prayers and responds to your cries for help. Then leave. This is good. Let go your concerns with God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guide your hearts and minds in the knowledge of Christ Jesus. So when we leave these things with God, our experience is also transformed. God is with us in them. And then meditate on good things, Philippians 4:8. And you could say, breathe deeply on good things. Practice that diaphragmatic breathing I've talked about this evening. So calm, celebrate, ask, leave, and meditate. Wow, it's 9 o'clock. I feel like tonight has gone really quickly. It's been great to be with you again. Thanks for joining us on YouTube, and those of you who've joined us on Zoom. If you're on YouTube, if you could hit subscribe, that would be great. We'd love to see you again. And do join us next week when I'm going to be wrapping up the Emotional Balance course for you. And remember, there are additional resources at mindersoulfoundation.org. The website's just now up there on the screen. And I'm going to make sure that the slide packs from these talks are also available to you all next week, to make sure that you can kind of download and listen back. I hope you found tonight helpful. Again, if you want to contact me during the week, you can send me an email if you want. Just will@stdionysus.org.uk or will@minersoulfoundation.org, and I'll try and incorporate any responses to your questions in the talk next week. We'll see you then. Have a really great week. Thanks for being with me. Don't forget to breathe.